So have you ever been slapped by God? Well, this actually happened to me.
Are you sure about that?
Hello everyone, I'm Professor Plink. I respond to various theological and ideological questions and claims from a rationalistic and naturalistic approach in an effort to give and explain the opposite viewpoint and help to balance the conversation. Today we're taking a look at a video from a creator called Big John Steele, a supposed former atheist who saw the light and turned away from his wicked, sinful non-belief and discovered the truth and the healing power of Jesus. Now, when taking a look at this video, I realized that this is something I haven't really touched on much before in my time as a counter-apologist. Former skeptics turned faithful. And, well, there's a very good reason for that, because they are in remarkably short supply. Because while religious switching from one faith to another is relatively common, and deconversion away from religion altogether is even more common, and that was the path that I took that brought me out of the religion I was raised with, conversion from atheism into a religious faith is exceedingly rare. Pew Research's most recent study on religious switching found that among atheists, less than 1% claim to have become more religious over time, while 72% became even less religious, 24% staying the same, and 4% a bit of both. But yeah, that would mean that less than 1% of confirmed self-described atheists become even a little more religious throughout their lifetime. But hey, that only accounts for people who still self-identify themselves as atheists. It wouldn't account for people who have converted out of atheism and into, say, Christianity, like our friend John here today has. Well, even there, the numbers are still not very good, as about 91 million US adults, or 35%, have switched their religion since childhood. And from that, about 9 million, or 3.6%, have become Christians. Now that would also account for people who were raised as some other faith other than Christian who became Christians, not just atheists. While more than 57 million, or 21.9%, have left Christianity. Meanwhile, about 53 million, or 20.2%, have become religiously unaffiliated, which is where you'll find all self-described atheists. Meanwhile, about 9 million, a mere 3.5%, have joined a religion after being raised without one. And again, that would mean all religions. So a very small amount of people who were raised unreligious became religious, and even fewer of those became Christians. So while there are some actual former atheists come Christians out there, they aren't in abundant supply. And furthermore, whenever I do hear a "I once was lost, now am found" supposed former atheist conversion story, it almost always amounts to someone who was always a believer, went through a little rebellious teenager phase where they hated going to church or were mad at God because something bad happened to them, and after a few years went back to the faith that they never really left but only put up on a shelf for a while. But then they try to spin that into their apologetic tactic of, "I was once a lowly, non-believing atheist heathen just like you, so take my word for it." But hey, maybe I'm jumping the gun here and way off base when it comes to John and his conversion story. Maybe he's going to be coming with some rock-solid, totally justifiable reasons to believe in not only God, but the big J.C. Crossrider himself version of theism that totally aren't tired old apologetics that have been debunked more times than P. Diddy's innocence.
Don't hold your breath.
Well, you never know. So let's get stuck in and hear from Big John why he stopped being an atheist and became a Christian, and why you should too. But before we get to that, if you end up liking what you see in this video and would like to help out the channel, make sure to subscribe and click the bell so you'll always be notified when new content comes out. Check out my social media, including my Patreon, Twitter, and Blue Sky, all linked in the description. And of course, like this video, pop in a comment. All that goes a long way towards pleasing the YouTube algorithm, who recognizes no royal ruler, rather reaches for research and rationality over ridiculous rituals, rarely do religious reflect on our remarkable reality, rather relying on revelation over reason and reverent rhetoric over reflection. May it keep my channel motoring along. Now on to today's video.
So have you ever been slapped by God? Well, this actually happened to me. Not metaphorically, I mean like body slammed by the divine. I know, that sounds completely insane, but hear me out for a second.
No, hear me out for a second. If you're saying that a divine, ethereal being, who supposedly is without form and exists outside of time and space, took physical form in order to attack and physically harm you, then your first step should be to head to the hospital and get yourself a CAT scan, because there's likely something very wrong with your brain. I would imagine that even the deeply religious would agree with that. Because if you went into the confessional, bless me, Father, for I have sinned and all that, and told the priest that God actually took physical form in order to WWE rock bottom you, I believe he would conclude that some random who was just claiming to be God actually attacked you. Or if you would say there was no physical person there, but the physical attack still happened, the priest would recommend medical or psychiatric help. But I imagine you don't actually mean God physically body slammed you, but metaphorically. Even though you said not metaphorically and indicated that this was a physical attack that one could only conclude came from the Lord and by no earthly means. So, now that all that's established, now I'll hear you out.
See, I was in a pretty dark place at the time. I was homeless, I was sleeping in the back of a gym, dealing with depression, the whole 9 yards. And then out of nowhere, this overwhelming presence just showed up. It wasn't just some warm, fuzzy feeling or a voice in my head. It's more like someone who was just bigger than reality walked into the room and was like, all right, that's enough, get up. And I'm not kidding, it changed me overnight.
So, yeah, just as I said, you meant metaphorically. Now, though I do find that I was once an atheist and now have seen the light of Christianity stories are relatively rare, when I do hear them, this is what they tend to be. Someone was in a bad way, living a bad life, replete with drugs and alcohol, homelessness, destitute, hitting actual rock bottom, not the WWE move. And finding faith in religion was their path out of that. Now look, I'm not going to criticize how people pull themselves up from bottoming out. When you're drowning, any lifeline will do, even a religious one. Any port in a storm, as they say, even if that port is a church filled with parishioners. And I've no desire to attack the faith of someone whose life was greatly improved, possibly even saved, by investing in theistic belief. But you've come into the apologetics realm. You're now attempting to affirm the truth of and convince others of your God belief. And so now you've got to get the same treatment as any other apologist. Rigid, dispassionate examination of your claims and the harsh reality of naturalistic and rationalistic explanations. So, what's more likely? That an unproven, ethereal, supernatural, divine being of all power and all knowledge acted upon you physically, mentally, and emotionally, or that you were spiraling in life and in a really bad way, but due to addiction and habitual patterns that you felt you couldn't break, you believed you couldn't improve your life on your own, and so you psychologically needed a saving grace, a mental and emotional focal point that you could view as being able to do the things that you believed yourself incapable of. Namely, changing you in a positive way to improve your life. A change that you ended up doing yourself, hopefully with help and support from friends and family, but that you now attribute to literal divine intervention. Hey, if belief in God is what you needed to get you there, more power to you. But in the realm of discussing reality and what actually happened during your recovery, you did it yourself, pal. So kudos to you, but not to your imaginary friend.
Millions, if not billions of people throughout time and around the world have claimed to have an experience with God. That's not just a few random breakdowns. That's actually data, right? Now, does that prove God exists to you? Probably not. But it's convincing for those who go through it. And if even one of those encounters is the real deal, well, that changes everything.
Millions, if not billions of people throughout history and all around the world have claimed to have encountered ghosts, or vampires, or something akin to vampires based on the cultural stories of their time, or supernatural monsters of various kinds. If even one of them were true, well, that would change everything, wouldn't it? Except, none of them were true. This argument, well, it's barely even an argument. Hey, billions of people said this thing. How could a billion people be wrong? Well, it's just a bandwagon fallacy, or a derivative of the appeal to popularity fallacy. You're trying to argue that because a large number of people have believed something, that it's likely to be true. Because if even one of those billions of people are correct, then God must exist. And hey, how could they all be wrong? Well, because they can all be wrong. Because if a billion people claim to have seen something that doesn't actually exist, then they were, in fact, all wrong. Countless people over the course of human history have claimed to have had visions of the future, specifically world-ending visions. And yet, the world is still here. Every end times prophecy has failed. Every single one of those people have been wrong. Yes, everyone who makes a certain claim can indeed be wrong about it, even if there are millions or billions of people in that number. And let's also not forget that those billions of people who have claimed to have seen God have completely disagreed on which God they saw. This is something that's common with apologists when they're trying to make these kinds of arguments. They're going for big numbers in belief and religious experience in order to strengthen their claims, but conveniently ignore the complete disagreement on what belief or what kind of experience the claims were to have had. It's not just billions of people have claimed to see God. It's a bunch of people claim to encounter Zeus, and a bunch of people claim to have encountered Odin, and a bunch of people claim to have spoken to Vishnu, and a lot of people claim to have heard Brahma. A number of people claim to have touched Krishna, and a lot of people claim to have felt the presence of Yahweh, etc. And given the supposed singular nature of the God that you believe in, to the exclusion of the existence of all others, then anyone claiming to have experienced any God who isn't your God is actually evidence against your God. But you sneakily try to use it as evidence for your side. Well, none of it is actual good evidence. Everyone can indeed be wrong. 100% of people claiming to have had any experience of any God can indeed all be either mistaken or lying. And, to go with your own line of thinking, if even one of those people claiming to have experienced any God other than the Christian God are correct, well then that changes everything. And Christianity is therefore automatically false.
Didn't see that coming, did you?
Picture this, you walk into the woods, you look around for maybe a minute. You don't see any deer, so you turn around and you walk back out and say, well, I guess deer don't exist. That would be ridiculous, right? But that's honestly what atheism feels like to me. We got a massive universe with billions of galaxies, dimensions we can't even wrap our heads around, and we've explored maybe 0.0001% of it. And then we're like, yep, definitely no God here.
Sure, because we've never heard this one before.
I said, so that's what you do know? He said, yes. I said, and that's what you don't know? He said, yes. But this does exist, you just haven't discovered it yet. Yes. Therefore, could God not exist in a dimension that you haven't yet discovered?
Hey, if we looked up at the night sky and we didn't immediately see a giant space sloth called Snacktopus pooping gumballs, well, it would be illogical of us to conclude that there was no such giant space sloth out there, pooping the gumballs that eventually wind up in every grocery store or quarter vending machine that we come across. Therefore, we should default to automatically believing in Snacktopus until such time as 100% of the universe, as well as all heretofore undiscovered incorporeal realms and alternate dimensions that might exist, have been completely discovered and explored to conclusively rule out the existence of Snacktopus. Now, that's just good logic right there. No, John, that isn't how it works. Atheism is not insisting that nowhere in existence could anything that could ever be construed or misidentified as a God exists. Some atheists may make that claim, but in general, atheism is the lack of belief in or the non-acceptance of any God claim.
Atheism. So this is atheism in a nutshell. You say there's a God. I say, can you prove that? You say no. I say I don't believe you then.
So with that out of the way, let's get back to your deer analogy. Yes, it would be silly to walk into the woods, not immediately see any deer, and conclude that therefore deer must not exist. But that would be silly because there's mountains of evidence for the existence of deer. Right down to there being actual deer in captivity today. You can go and look at them yourself. There's numerous deer heads mounted on hunters' walls that they've shot and killed. Hell, if deer don't exist, then what the hell was that antlered animal that I accidentally hit with my car when I was a teenager? And it died in the accident, and I had to call the county sheriff to come and have it removed from the side of the road. No, John, a better analogy would be you walk into the woods and don't immediately see any unicorns, and then conclude that unicorns must not exist. Well, not seeing them immediately, as well as there not being any reliable evidence of their existence. No unicorns in captivity. No heads of unicorns on hunters' walls. No evidence of any kind for their existence. No video footage. No physical remains discovered. Sure, plenty of spurious accounts from unreliable supposed eyewitnesses who claim to have seen one, but nothing substantial. Nothing concrete. But hey, we haven't explored 100% of the entire universe, so who's to say that there aren't unicorns somewhere out there? Therefore, we should just believe in them by default until their existence is conclusively disproven, right? Same with Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, dragons, leprechauns, fairies, vampires, giant space sloths. Or is the more logical position to default to not believing in any such things until such a time as they can be reasonably concluded to actually exist? So, do you have any such reasonable arguments as to your God's existence?
I'm gonna go with no.
Now I know what you're thinking. Atheism isn't claiming that God doesn't exist, it's just the lack of belief in a God. Okay, but is it though? Because according to Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, atheism actually means the proposition that God does not exist.
Hey John, if you're gonna bullshit your audience with disingenuous lies, maybe don't include the proof that you're lying right alongside your citation. It clearly states that the word atheism is polysemous. It has multiple related meanings. In the psychological sense of the word, atheism is a psychological state, specifically the state of being an atheist, where an atheist is defined as someone who is not a theist, and a theist is defined as someone who believes that God exists, or that there are gods. This generates the following definition: atheism is the psychological state of lacking the belief that God exists. Now, I would imagine you had to read that part before you got to the part that you liked. You know, the part that seemed to back up your position that you wanted to push. And so you ignored that icky part that explained atheism as a lack of belief and instead keyed in on the part that suited your interests, while only flashing it on the screen just long enough for people to read the highlighted portion that you wanted them to focus on and ignored the rest. Suffice it to say, while there is a notion of atheism that it is an insistence that no gods exist, and I and any other atheist are perfectly willing to admit that those atheists exist, that is not the entirety of what atheism is. And negative atheism, or lack of belief atheism, is also a thing. And you know that, because you looked right past where it said that in your own citation.
Why the fuck you lying? Why you always lying?
But fine, let's play that game. Let's just say you lack the belief in God. Okay, cool. Why do you lack that belief? Well, I haven't seen enough evidence. Really? Would you say the same thing about aliens? Would you say you don't believe in aliens because NASA hasn't personally called you? Or do you think, well, there's billions of planets out there, so aliens probably do exist?
For one, bad analogy. But fine, yes, I do lack an affirmative belief in any aliens, as none have been established to exist. But then you talk about saying, well, there are billions of planets out there, so aliens probably do exist. Well, John, that's not the same thing as saying that you do believe in aliens at all. Yeah, aliens probably do exist out there somewhere. But I'm not going to assume without evidence that any particular alien concept does exist. That's the first way that your analogy fails. See, you aren't proposing some nebulous, undefined being or beings that could be classified as a god or gods. You're proposing a very specific, very detailed version of God, the Christian God. So let's rework that analogy a little bit. Are you saying you don't believe in two-headed aliens who are joined at the waist cat-dog style, whose whole civilization is centered around accordion music and square dancing, and who speak a language called Flarfluvian that primarily utilizes a variety of armpit farts to convey meaning? Now, do you have an affirmative belief that that kind of alien exists? And if not, why not? I thought we'd established that aliens are likely to exist out there among the billions of planets. Or could it be that the more specific claims about the nature of a proposed thing are made, and made without reasonable evidence to do so, the less likely it is that said thing actually exists? So that's the first mistake your analogy made, trying to say that your very specific unwarranted assumption is no different than a different, extremely generalized, and fairly likely assumption. But then also, there's the little fact that you're comparing the likelihood of something that's entirely physical and natural existing, like aliens, in an expansive universe. You're comparing that to the likelihood of something entirely metaphysical and supernatural existing in the universe. In case that's not clear, there is no evidence for the existence of anything supernatural, and no reason to assume that anything supernatural exists. It is a massive leap to assume anything like a God concept can exist. But aliens? Any non-Earth-based biological organism existing and originating on another planet? Yeah, that's not nearly as much of a stretch as any concept of God. If tomorrow a little asteroid the size of a basketball were to hit the Earth, and inside little bits of non-terrestrial bacteria were to be found, it would be an awesome discovery to be sure. But really, nobody would be mind-blown by it. We expect to find life on other planets, or that came from other planets at some point. But an ethereal, disembodied mind, who exists outside of time and space, whatever that even means, who has all power to affect anything it wishes, thereby violating the laws of physics at will, eternal creator of the entire physical universe, and deeply, deeply concerned with whether or not you touch yourself at night? Yeah, color me unconvinced.
What about abiogenesis? You know, life coming from non-life? Do you believe in that? Because if you do, show me the lab where they actually made that happen.
Why, I'm glad you asked, John. NASA Ames reproduces the building blocks of life in laboratory. NASA scientists studying the origin of life have reproduced uracil, cytosine, and thymine, three key components of our hereditary material, in the laboratory. They discovered that an ice sample containing pyrimidine exposed to ultraviolet radiation under space-like conditions produces these essential ingredients of life. Pyrimidine is a ring-shaped molecule made up of carbon and nitrogen and is the central structure for uracil, cytosine, and thymine, which are all three parts of a genetic code found in ribonucleic RNA and deoxyribonucleic acids DNA. RNA and DNA are central to protein synthesis, but also have many other roles. We have demonstrated for the first time that we can make uracil, cytosine, and thymine, all three components of RNA and DNA, non-biologically in a laboratory under conditions found in space, said Michael Nuevo, research scientist at NASA's Ames Research Center, Moffett Field, California. We are showing that these laboratory processes, which simulate conditions in outer space, can make several fundamental building blocks used by living organisms on Earth. There is a reason abiogenesis is the leading and prevailing notion for how life developed on this planet by the whole of science, because that is where all of the evidence points. And we've been making continual strides in that area ever since science first started looking into the origin of life. From the Miller-Urey experiments that showed how the most basic chemical ingredients could self-assemble under the proper conditions, to more recent findings like the one listed above. Abiogenesis isn't an unfounded and pie-in-the-sky assumption based on nothing. It's based on every scrap of reliable empirical evidence that exists.
So here's what I've noticed. Every argument for atheism is actually just an argument against a specific type of God.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen any actual arguments for atheism.
That's because atheism isn't a belief. There's nothing to argue for in atheism. I mean, did you miss it before? Let me run it again for you, John.
Atheism. So this is atheism in a nutshell. You say there's a God. I say, can you prove that? You say no. I say, I don't believe you then.
There are no atheistic arguments because there's nothing to argue for. There's only the theistic claims to be argued against. I'm not making any claims as an atheist, so I have no argument I need to make, nor even any argument I could make. How does one make an argument when one has no claim to begin with? What would it be that I would be trying to convince you of in order to make an atheistic argument? What, that there is no God? Well, that would need to start with what kind of God I'm arguing for the non-existence of. And therefore, it would just become arguing against that God claim rather than arguing for atheism, whatever that even means. Yes, by its very nature, all atheistic arguments are arguments against specific concepts of God. Just like all arguments for not believing in unicorns are going to be arguments against the existence of unicorns, not arguing for a unicornism. Just like all arguments for not believing in Bigfoot are going to be arguments against the existence of Bigfoot, not arguments for a Bigfootism. I mean, what even is this dipshittery, John? You're saying that atheism isn't something that it isn't trying to be, and therefore it's wrong or illogical? What are you even talking about, dude? John, buddy, we really need to leave this attempt to attack atheism behind because it's all just the same old song and dance that apologists have been doing for years. Trying to flip the burden of proof onto atheism when we aren't the ones trying to prove something. Trying to insist that atheism is a belief system when we have nothing that we're believing in. Trying to insist that atheism is a worldview when it certainly is not. Atheism is one answer to one question. Do you believe in any God? No. Trying to claim that we then need to prove that, or that one answer makes up the entirety of how we view the world and our place in it, our view of right and wrong, or gives meaning to our lives, well, that's all just dumb as all get out. So you really need to get off of trying to flip atheism into something that it isn't and get to explaining why you actually believe what you believe. So let's get on to that.
So, why is there something rather than nothing? Why does anything exist at all? Atoms, galaxies, consciousness, my cat, none of it had to exist.
How do you know that? What evidence is there that nothing was ever even a possibility? I'm unaware of any evidence that shows that there ever was nothing. As far as we're able to tell, something has always existed. Since the Big Bang, which is as far back as we're currently able to examine evidence for, was not the explosion of the universe out of nothing. It was instead the expansion of the current presentation of our universe from an initial state of high density and temperature. Everything that exists today has always existed as far back as we're able to tell. It's just that it's existed in a different form. It existed as primordial energy, which then expanded and cooled, allowing that energy to change into the first atoms and physical matter. Through billions of years of movement and change brought on by the fundamental forces of the universe, like gravity and the nuclear force, some of that matter became galaxies, the Earth, your brain, which produces what you experience as consciousness, and your cat. It all always existed in some form or other, and the unavoidable natural forces of the universe eventually turned it all into what we have today. So, when you say none of it had to exist, I would disagree. I would say that it all had to exist, because it always existed. It just took some time to get to existing in the way that it does today.
We can imagine a universe with nothing, no space, no time, no matter, or at least conceive of it.
I can't. And, if I may be so bold, I don't think you can either. I think it's easy to say that we can conceive of something. I mean, I can say I can conceive of a square circle. I can say that I can conceive of 5 apples that are actually only 3. I can say that I can conceive of an invisible rainbow. It's easy to say that you can conceive of something that is beyond conception. We are temporal beings, and we can't really think around the idea of temporal existence. Which is why people can say easily enough that they can conceive of God existing outside of time, yet they still think about God carrying out actions and processes from outside of time. Actions and processes that require time in order for him to carry out. Carrying out complex actions, like creating a universe, and then making light, and then making land, and then making life, and then making humans, etc. On the 7th day he rested and all that. Well, how the hell have 7 days passed for a God if he's outside of time? We still conceive of God using temporal terms and conceptions, because that's really all we can do. It's the same thing with no space. We really can't imagine there being no height, width, or depth. The only thing that comes close would be something like our imagination, because the things that we envision in our minds don't actually have height, width, or depth. They're just thoughts. Except the way that we're imagining them, they do. I don't imagine a bicycle without three-dimensional existence. In my mind's eye, it does have those things. It does have height, width, and depth. So even when we imagine something without physical existence or location in space-time, we still imagine it as if it did have physical existence and location in space-time. So, no, I think you're just saying that you can conceive of no time or space or existence. I doubt you actually can. But all of that is moot anyway. What actually exists is a far cry from what you can imagine to exist. Hey, maybe that's the root of your entire problem here. You think that your imagination counts as reality. You know, like your God.
So the real question is reality made of things that could not have existed? Or is there something that must exist no matter what?
This is the contingency argument. As I've already said, as far as I'm aware, everything that exists has always existed in some form. Therefore, everything that exists has to exist no matter what, because energy cannot be created or destroyed. It only changes from one form to another. First law of thermodynamics. So, contingency argument is bunk. What else you got?
The universe doesn't just exist. It exists in a very specific way, fine-tuned down to absurdly precise values, perfectly calibrated to allow life. So imagine that this mixer here is the universe. Every knob here controls a fundamental constant of physics. This right here is the gravitational constant. Turn it up a hair, stars burn out too fast. Turn it down, no stars at all. This one right here is the strong nuclear force. Slightly higher, no hydrogen, no water. Slightly lower, no carbon, no chemistry, no you.
I'm just gonna say it. The universal constants are not just not fine-tuned, they aren't tuned at all. Saying that things are fine-tuned gives the impression that they could even be tuned to different values. Like with your mixing board analogy. Each constant has a dial that you can turn one way or the other, changing the values of that constant. Well, if that analogy is going to work on the constants of the universe, then I assume you know how to change the gravitational constant, right? Or how to alter the value of the nuclear force? So please, enlighten us. Just what is needed to turn that cosmic dial and change the constants of the universe, John?
Well, we're waiting.
Oh, that's right. You can't. Because, see, they're called constants for a reason. Because, and this may blow your mind, they're constant. They don't change. Near as we can tell, they can't change. We have no idea how to even go about altering gravity or the nuclear force to even the slightest degree. Now, earlier, you claimed that abiogenesis was only an assumption that wasn't logical to surmise as the beginning of life because it had never been reproduced in a lab, even though it more or less has been. Well, if you can do that, then I can say that until some laboratory or researcher manages to alter the universal constants to even the slightest hair, then it's an unwarranted assumption that you're making that they could even be different from what they are. So, the fine-tuning argument is foundationally based on the idea that the constants of the universe could have easily been different from what they are, and the likelihood of them being what they are and not some other way that would preclude life existing are astronomical. Therefore, there must have been a guiding supernatural hand, the hand of God, who tweaked the cosmic dials in just the right way to allow life to arise. But I see no reason to think that there was any chance that the universal constants could have been any different from what they are now. So basically, all of those dials on your mixing board, well, they're not only all set to the constants necessary for life, but the dials are also broken off, inaccessible, and immutable. So what are the odds for the values on that mixing board being what they are when there's no possible way to change them at all? It's 100%. How many universes do we have to examine to determine the range of values that the constants could have? We have one. One universe to draw data from. Have the constant values in that one universe ever changed? No. Not that we've ever been able to tell. So, what are the odds that our universe would have the precise values that it does, and that those values would be constant and unchanging? The odds, near as we can tell, are 1 in 1, or 100%. You can't claim God did something when there was no possibility of that thing not happening, God or no God. So, the fine-tuning argument is bunk. What else do you have, John?
If I could show you the best explanation for what we see in the Gospels, is that Jesus actually rose from the dead. Well, then you got two options. You can either engage with it and try to refute the data with a stronger model, or you could just say, God not real though.
Actually, if I wanted to refute the idea that Jesus resurrecting was the best explanation for what we see in the Gospels, all I would need to do is offer a better explanation. Such as that the Gospels were written after the fact, by authors who wanted to push the idea of the resurrection of Jesus, and so they made shit up that didn't actually happen. So, John, let me ask you this. What's more likely? That H.P. Lovecraft, August Derleth, Robert E. Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert Bloch, and others, who all wrote about Cthulhu and the Great Old Ones and other cosmic gods, were actually writing about real beings who actually exist? Or is it more likely that they were all writing fiction about the same characters? So, is it more likely that the gospel authors who all wrote about Jesus resurrecting from the dead, and they did so because it actually happened? Or is it more likely that they were all writing fiction about the same character? I mean, especially given that biblical historians have basically confirmed that none of the Gospels were written by the people that they're named after. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John certainly did not write the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Bart Ehrman has stated that critical scholars are widely agreed that the earliest Gospel of Mark, written about 70 CE, that Matthew and Luke were written some years later, say around 80 to 85 CE, and that John was the last Gospel, written around 90 to 95 CE. That would be, in some cases, as many as 60 years after Jesus' death, written by authors who were not there to see any of it happen and were, at best, recounting what stories had been passed around telephone style for 6 decades before finally writing it down. At worst, making shit up out of whole cloth. And you think an actual resurrection from the dead is the better explanation?
How stupid are you?
So that was Big John Steele and his ruminations on why he left atheism, why God must exist, and why Christianity best represents that God. His arguments for God and Christianity were really old hat and left a lot to be desired, but he started off with a general apologetic attack of atheism, misinterpreting it as a belief system and as a worldview, which makes me seriously question whether or not he ever actually was an atheist. I don't want to get into a no true Scotsman fallacy or gatekeep atheism, but if he was truly a non-believer and his non-belief was actually a belief for him, or him not believing in God somehow made up his entire conception of the world, morality, meaningfulness, and motivation, then, well, he had some pretty messed up things going on in his head to begin with. And he admitted that, with a hard luck story that so regularly accompanies claims of conversion to theism: hitting rock bottom, drugs, poverty, and general hopelessness. Now, to me, this highlights the predatory nature of religious belief. It so often tends to sink its claws into people when they're at their lowest and are desperate for something, anything, to believe in that will pull them out of the sorry situation and life that they find themselves in. Next thing you know, they're singing with the choir on Sundays, filling up that collection plate, and joining the chorus calling the gay couple down the street groomers who will burn in hell for their sinful depravity. But frankly, that was the only part of John's video that had any sort of resonance with me. While I've thankfully never been in such dire straits myself, I can sympathize with the need for some kind of a path out of the darkness that your life has fallen into, even if that path goes through the church and theistic belief. But understanding why one would be inclined to fall into faith is no acquiescence to its truth, and it seems much more likely that John wasn't slapped by God, but that he told himself that he was because that belief was going to get him out of the shit situation that he found himself in, even though it was built on a false belief. Because when your life is in shambles, a false belief is better that might help fix things than no belief which won't help fix things at all. But beyond that hard luck story, he really just made 4 points. 1, that atheism is a belief system that doesn't make any arguments and therefore it's weak, even though atheism is not a belief system, and it only exists in response to theistic belief and arguments that atheism seeks to debunk. He even said that atheism only exists to debunk theistic claims, and that was somehow a flaw, even though it's literally the sole thing that atheism is. It's the primary feature of atheism, not a flaw. Then he actually got around to attempting to argue for his belief in God with his next 3 points. The contingency argument, which is built on the false premise that everything came from nothing, and without that premise, the whole argument falls apart. But near as we're able to ascertain, everything that exists didn't come from nothing, but in fact always existed in a different form, thereby making the contingency argument collapse. Then he went into the fine-tuning argument, which is built on the false premise that the universal constants could change and were just as likely to have any other value than what they do. Without that premise, the whole argument falls apart. But near as we're able to ascertain, the universal constants are fixed, unchangeable, and there's no reason to think that they ever could be different from what they are, thereby making the fine-tuning argument collapse. Lastly, he moved into arguing for Christianity by saying that the best explanation for what's written in the Bible is that it actually happened and that it was being accurately recorded by Bible authors. Except it's known that the claimed Bible authors are not actual Bible authors at all, and it's much more likely that the biblical accounts were the transcriptions of myths and fables passed around by believers decades after and far removed from the actual events, thereby making the argument from the Bible collapse. In the end, I don't begrudge people like John who used religion as a motivation to get their lives in order. But just as I would tell someone who stopped drinking because they thought that there were little monsters living inside alcohol that would twist up their guts if they ever drank it, that's nice and all, but that's bullshit, buddy. Especially if they're trying to convince everyone else of the little alcohol monsters. It's the same reason that, at a certain point, you tell people Santa isn't real, even though it was useful in getting the kids to straighten up and fly right, lest the big guy in red doesn't bring them any Christmas presents. A false belief to compel better behavior is still a false belief. And if you want to hold it for yourself, by yourself, and keep it to yourself, well, you won't hear boo from me. But when you put it out there for the whole world to see and insist that not only is this why you believe in God, but why everyone else should too, well, then you're going to hear about why your beliefs don't hold water. And Johnny, your beliefs are practically a colander for all the water that they hold. And so that is where we'll end things for today. So thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like this video, comment, and subscribe so you'll always be notified when a new video comes out. Check me out on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Patreon if you'd like to support my work directly. My Teespring if you want some Plinky merchandise, all that link below in the description. Special shout out to my most recent super thankers here on YouTube, Salvi Mike and Autumnal Fling. And with that said, until next time, I'm Professor Plink reminding you to keep striving for greater understanding. It's the best way to get wherever you want to go.